people who made it, for I have always believed it, and I believe it now, and you know who I am. America.
All right, that is some applause for Paul Robeson up here, and famous song Ballad for Americans that came out in 1939 and was one of the last gasps of the Federal Theater Project, which had been part of the Works Progress Administration, which had not only sponsored a lot of the relief programs that are so famous during the Great Depression, but also sponsored a series of programs for writers and artists and musicians to be employed, but also to make their contributions to American culture. Paul Robeson is a really fascinating figure from this period. He is someone who was born in the late 19th century in 1898, the son of a formerly enslaved father and an abolitionist mother, and he grows up in New Jersey, in Princeton and other towns, and then goes on to Rutgers and Columbia Law School, becomes an All-American football player, a star debater, gets his law degree, and is this kind of Renaissance man to an amazing level during a period when, of course, it was very, very difficult for Black men, even in the North, to access this kind of public presence. He ends up not being a lawyer for a variety of reasons, many of which have to do with racial discrimination. But in the 20s and 30s, he discovers that he also has this amazing set of musical talents, and through the Harlem Renaissance and into the politics and cultural ferment of the 1930s, becomes one of the most prominent cultural figures in the United States. He stars first in a musical called Showboat. He goes on to star in Othello on Broadway. And when the 1930s come along, he also becomes politically radicalized and is really central to that ferment of the 1930s, to that broad New Deal and Popular Front coalition we've talked about, to labor politics, to civil rights politics, and anti-fascist politics, especially through the orbit of the Communist Party. And during the 1930s, Robeson, like many Americans, gets very interested in not only the Communist Party, but the Soviet Union. Because at a moment when it looks like American capitalism has collapsed, when the United States is maybe not rising to the anti-fascist fight, at least not yet, to many people, the Soviet Union emerges as a possible model. Now, there are many things going on in the Soviet Union in the 1930s that are deeply problematic, and we're going to talk about a few of those. But there's a kind of romance to the Soviet Union on the American left in the 1930s. And so when Paul Robeson comes and sings Ballad for Americans in 1939, it's at a very interesting moment. It becomes one of the most popular songs, though you heard, it's 10 minutes long, and it's this kind of romp through American history. It starts with King George in 1776 and moves through the Civil War and then moves up to a kind of vision of the American everyman, to a kind of racial liberalism that is coming into vogue in the 30s on the American left. And it is popular enough that it is played that year, the following year in 1940, at both the Republican Convention and at the Communist Party convention. So that's really the only time, to my knowledge, such a thing has ever happened in American history. But it's a widespread song, and it really gets at something about the narrative that many Americans want to tell about this country in 1940. And once the war comes along, Robeson remains this sort of central figure of patriotic rallying, especially within the labor movement and especially on the left. So our question for lecture today is how we get from that moment in which the federal government itself is sponsoring something like Ballad for Americans. The Federal Theater Project, though it's worth noting, the Federal Theater Project got canceled almost immediately after Ballad for Americans and that musical emerged. But how do we get from this moment to this one? This is 1949 and 1950, a moment when Paul Robeson's life has taken a very different and very dramatic turn. The photo on the right is of a riot and sort of mob uprising that happened in Peekskill, New York in 1949 when Paul Robeson went there in order to try to give a concert. Local Klan chapters, white supremacists, but also a number of other citizens, white citizens, turned out to prevent it from happening and attacked Robeson's supporters and audience. By the following year, the federal government had entered the story in a dramatic way, not only keeping Paul Robeson under surveillance, but stripping him of his passport and then ultimately hauling him before congressional committees to answer a question. Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And by extension, does that mean one way or another that you are not a true American? So that's what we're going to look at today in lecture, how we get from that moment in the late 30s, early 40s, that moment of the Popular Front, the New Deal, this kind of big liberal left coalition, to a moment in which the Communist Party has become the central target of American politics, broadly speaking, and that includes global politics as well as politics at home. So we're going to look a little bit at the prehistory of all of this in the teens, 20s, 30s, and up into the 40s. We're really going to focus on the period from the late 40s into the early 1950s, which see a sea change in American politics in all sorts of different ways. The United States acquires a much broader role in global affairs around the world, particularly with the rise of the Cold War. That precipitates a growing and permanent, in many ways, security state at home that is like anything that has ever existed before in American history. It has dramatic impacts on American domestic politics. From the 1940s onward, this question of who is American, who is un-American, a term that comes into wide circulation in this period, becomes one of the central questions of domestic politics. And it's a moment when that's being defined in new ways, particularly around the question of communism and socialism, whether you're talking about the Communist Party as an organization, or you're talking about some much wider universe of ideas about how government and society ought to be organized. It's really the central question of this period in terms of domestic politics. And we're going to finish up by looking at the figure that most people tend to think of when they think of anti-communist politics in the United States. But I'm going to make the case that Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, is maybe a little less significant than than his reputation might suggest. There are a lot of other things going on that make McCarthy and McCarthyism possible. And then there are a lot of things that really outlast McCarthy as we think about this period and the rise of anti-communism as what I would say is really the central logic of American politics from this point onward for several decades. And what I mean by that is that beginning around 1947 or so, it's almost impossible to participate in national politics, certainly in mainstream national politics, unless you identify in some overt way as an anti-communist. There are many varieties of anti-communism. There are still lots of debates, but it's almost what I would call an anti-communist consensus emerging. It is the thing that you have to be if you want to describe yourself as American and if you want to have a voice in the polity. The Cold War, writ large, is really the backdrop for all of this. It's worth noting that the term the Cold War was coined by our good friend Walter Lippmann. As in 1922, in the aftermath of the First World War, in the 1940s, after the Second World War, Walter Lippmann looks around the world and says, I'm going to try to figure out and define what's happening. Now, he's much older at this point. He's much more conservative, and he's a little bit crankier than he was during his utopian youth. But he looks around and says, there's something interesting and really disturbing that's starting to emerge in this moment of 1945, 46, 47. And he writes a book called The Cold War, A Study in U.S. Foreign Policy. He's troubled by what he sees happening, which is that as the Second World War was coming to an end, it was becoming increasingly clear that the alliance between the United States and the USSR, which had always been a fragile alliance, an uneasy alliance, is beginning to break apart and is going to come to define the post-war order in some significant way. And he warns Americans against this. He says this is going to cause problems for the country. He says, my objection to the policy of containment, which is the national security logic that has started to emerge, the idea of containing the Soviet Union, central to the Truman administration's approach. My objection is not that it seeks to confront the Soviet power with American power, but that the policy is misconceived and will result in a misuse of American power. For, as I have sought to show, it commits this country to a struggle which has for its objective nothing more substantial than the hope that in 10 or 15 years the Soviet power will, quote, break up or mellow, but it's going to commit the United States, he goes on, to a series of conflicts that it's not going to be able to get itself out of, both at home and abroad. And so when we talk about the Cold War, this is usually how we talk about it in terms of U.S. foreign policy, really as something that began in roughly 1947, something that comes to an end in 1991. But as I said, I think we want to think about this a little more broadly in the way that we're going to talk about it today. The Cold War as a descriptor and as a metaphor suggests that there was no actual war, no hot war. And of course, that turns out not to be true, and it turns out not to be true very quickly after this moment. Though we describe the Cold War as the war that didn't happen, nuclear weapons were not exchanged between the United States and the Soviet Union. They never went to war with each other. Nonetheless, the story of the Cold War is actually a story of a series of hot wars that occur all over the globe in the second half of the 20th century. In Asia, in places like Korea and Vietnam, in Africa through decolonization struggles, in Latin America, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s. So when we talk about the Cold War, it's worth keeping in mind that the Cold War was actually a hot war, in many ways quite a vicious and violent set of conflicts occurring all around the globe. The Cold War is also a little bit hard to define in its political contours. There's one definition of the Cold War that is about geopolitics, a kind of realist geopolitical struggle between two superpowers. And that's certainly part of what was going on. But what makes the Cold War complicated in many ways, both on the global stage, but especially at home, is that it is also framed as an ideological war. It is a war between two sets of ideas about how the world ought to be organized, about who has a right to do that organizing, and about certain fundamental principles that in the United States become defined as American principles or the American way of life. But it's a little hard to take apart what's at stake in all of this. One way of defining that is that it's an ideological struggle over how you organize your economic system, your political economy. Is this a struggle between the communist or socialist model and the capitalist model? But people in the 1940s and 50s have a lot of other ways of defining what is at stake in this ideological struggle that's called the Cold War, but that is also occurring at home. One of those is a set of conversations about religion and public religiosity, that this is a struggle between Christianity in particular, religion more broadly, and the atheistic communists over in the Soviet Union, as well as at home. There's a very interesting story about American religious culture and the ways that it enters politics in the 1940s and 50s. Huge surges of Americans going to church during these years. Another way that the Cold War abroad and at home gets defined is as a struggle between democracy and totalitarianism. It's about where power resides in your systems of governance. Similarly, there's a debate over individualism versus something called collectivism. What is the core unit of analysis? How ought political actors to act? Do they act as individuals? Is the preservation of the freedom of the individual the highest political value? Or is it the mass, the collective, and by extension, the state? And then finally, in the United States, as I've said, this emerges as really a debate about what is American and what the United States is all about and what it stands for. And this takes on particular power during this period, not just because of the Cold War or the Red Scare at home, but because Americans are very self-conscious about this big fact that they have come out of the Second World War with an enormous amount of power and influence. There are deep anxieties that the United States is actually not up to the task, culturally, politically, militarily. And so the 40s and 50s become this moment of deep searching, overt debate around these categories of American and un-American. For those of you who are American studies majors, this is the moment that American studies is born, and it's born out of this set of questions about what the nation is, what it's supposed to be, what it stands for, and in fact, what it's fighting for as this new era emerges. All right, so now I want to take a little bit of a step back and just talk about the United States and the Soviet Union before we get to this point. We said back when we were in World War I and its aftermath that one of the things that comes out of the First World War and its traumas is two sets of Russian revolutions, both of which happen in 1917. One, a sort of more liberal democratic revolution that's followed by then the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And in the United States, as in many places around the world, initially the Bolshevik Revolution sets off all sorts of enthusiasms among particularly political radicals, but other people who see this as a moment when the world, in fact, might be remade. Over there, that is a pamphlet that was handed out during the Seattle General Strike of 1919. And you can see that people are thinking through these parallels, right? If something like that could happen in Russia, if you could have a revolution there, could you have a revolution here as well? Now, there is, as we've discussed, a very quick backlash to that in 1919 and 1920, involving deportations, involving the crackdowns of the Red Scare. And for much of the 1920s, the question of communism, of revolution, of Bolshevism really goes into retreat. The United States refused throughout this whole period to recognize the Soviet Union. And so from the period from 1917 up to 1933, the US has no formal diplomatic relations with Russia. Well, both of those things begin to change when the New Deal comes along in 1933. Franklin Roosevelt recognizes the Soviet Union, sends over its first ambassador, a man named William Bullitt, whose papers are actually here at Yale. So if you're curious about that moment, you can investigate further. And then, as we discussed during our New Deal lecture, the 1930s see a surge of interest, enthusiasm built around the Communist Party and this kind of broad-based left that becomes very interested in not only labor organizing, but also civil rights and anti-fascist organizing. And this is the milieu in which Paul Robeson really acquires his political consciousness. The other thing that happens over the course of that period is that in 1935, Joseph Stalin declares that you're going to have a new strategy if you're on the global left. And he calls it the Popular Front. And what he does is urge communists to get out of the factional disputes they've been having with lots of other organizations and instead begin to work together in this united anti-fascist front. And that has a dramatic impact on politics in the United States. The Communist Party itself is always at once a kind of domestic, homegrown organization and an organization that is deeply tied in literal ways and in figurative ways and in imaginative ways to the Soviet Union. But as you can see from these two photos, one of the things that happens in the 30s is this shift from really a left politics, a Communist Party politics that is centered around the Soviet Union. Socialist construction in the Soviet Union, says the sign at the 1931 Communist Convention, versus where we are by 1938. In an effort to be part of this Popular Front coalition, the Communist Party also begins claiming all sorts of American images and themes. And it's really the only time in American history, this very brief period of the late 30s and into the early 40s, that the Communist Party can be considered anything like a mainstream participant in American politics. Another example here, the Communist Party in the late 30s adopts the slogan, I don't know how well you can read it there, "Communism is the Americanism of the 20th century." Now that doesn't hold, right, that idea, but it gives you some sense of just how dramatic the change is just a few years later when there's such a major backlash against it. Some of that backlash began to set in 1939 when, as the Second World War was getting started, Stalin and Hitler signed a non-aggression pact. And there's a lot of dismay about that, as you can imagine, on the American left and the anti-fascist coalition. 4 years earlier, Stalin had said, "We are the champions of anti-fascism, join together." And by then in 1939, he signed a pact with Adolf Hitler. That only lasts for 2 years because in June of 1941, Hitler invades the Soviet Union and the contours of the Second World War emerge. Throughout the war, the United States and the Soviet Union were, as we have said, allies and uneasy allies, but allies nonetheless. And what that produces in the war years is really a profusion of popular culture that is suddenly championing the Soviet Union, championing the Russian people as great heroes and allies of America. Again, the only moment in all of 20th century US history that you see this kind of culture being produced. These are mainstream Hollywood films. This is one of the more famous of them, Mission to Moscow. It's really a piece of pro-Soviet propaganda starring an actor portraying Joseph Stalin. All right, so that is the big picture as we get to the end of the war. You've had, of course, lots of anti-communist sentiment in the United States for a long time, but you've also had this decade or so of a different kind of accord, and that collapses very, very quickly. We talked on Tuesday about the self-consciousness of planning for the post-war order that was so central to the Second World War, that it started in 1941, even before the United States was in the war, and was really built around a couple of ideas. One is trying to correct for the mistakes of the First World War. The other is trying to forward the New Deal project, and in particular, to prevent a Great Depression from setting back in once the war came to an end. As the war is coming into its final years, you see a wave of institution building that is really intended to solve those problems. The creation of the United Nations, which is obviously going to be based in the United States, as an attempt to solve that post-World War I problem of global order. You see a new set of economic global institutions coming into being: the International Monetary Fund, the Bretton Woods agreements, and these are some of the conversations over there being had among policymakers, Anglo-American conversations, as well as broader conversations. At home, there is, before the end of the war, a set of policies and ideas put in place that are supposed to kind of extend the New Deal promise into the post-war years. The most prominent of them, the GI Bill, which gives a set of benefits for anyone who served in the armed forces. It is not always evenly distributed in the end, but is a pretty broad set of commitments to, as you can see, jobs, loans, training, homes, college education, medical care for U.S. veterans. And we discussed this feeling of confidence in all of this. This is Harry Truman, just a few days after the war ended, that he is confident that there is this new moment emerging in which the United States is not only going to be a powerful force in the world, but is going to have certain sets of labor, economic, and social welfare guarantees at home. At the same time that all of that is happening, there are a lot of deep worries about the post-war order. One of the first of them is what's going to happen, particularly to Germany, to Eastern Europe in the aftermath of the war. And there are a series of talks, especially about the fate of Poland and the influence of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, that go on both during Franklin Roosevelt's time in office and then are extended under Harry Truman. And those talks and the tensions around them really come to frame a lot of what happens in the years that follow. By 1946, just a few months out from the end of the war, you're already seeing, first of all, Stalin reminding the world that the Soviet Union is still a Marxist-Leninist government that believes in global revolution, and in reaction, a set of statements, declarations, and strategies coming out of the Anglo-American world saying, okay, this is clearly the battle of the future. This is Winston Churchill in Fulton, Missouri in early 1946, declaring famously that an iron curtain is descending over Eastern Europe, becomes one of the great metaphors of the Cold War. And as you can see, you're not even a year out from the end of the World War II alliance. What happens in the United States is then a very quick turn away from demobilization, which had started to happen in 45 and 46, toward thinking about remilitarization and toward thinking about how the government is going to be structured, and in particular, how the military is going to be structured in this new world of conflict. And the years from 1947 through 1915 are an incredible period of institution building and remobilization in the United States that gives birth to something that really hadn't existed before, which is a permanent peacetime security state with a large standing military and with a new set of intelligence agencies that come into being on a permanent basis. The law that is most important in all of that is the 1947 National Security Act, which establishes the National Security Council, establishes the CIA, establishes much of what we now know of as our security establishment, our foreign policy establishment. And that's a set of commitments that this is going to be, first of all, a long struggle. It's going to require a new set of commitments and ways of doing business, and that this US presence around the world, whether it's an intelligence gathering presence or a military presence, is going to be long-lasting and permanent. A series of events follow in which the Cold War begins to get pretty hot pretty quickly. The Berlin airlift, the Marshall Plan, which comes into being really as one of the first overt Cold War soft power strategies in which the United States is providing recovery aid to many places around the world, but not to the Soviet Union. And then finally, we have the creation of NATO in the late 1940s as an alliance of Western European and Anglo-American countries that are going to commit themselves to battle both ideologically and literally with Soviet power. That leads in 1949 and 1950 to a really dramatic set of events that push a lot of this politics forward. And I think it can be hard from our perspective on the other side of the Cold War to imagine just how shocking and dramatic these events of 1949 and 1950 were. First, a revolution in China had been a US ally during the war, suddenly becomes a communist country. The Soviet Union in 1949 acquires nuclear weapons. This very brief period in which the United States had a monopoly on that comes to an end. And then by 1950, the United States finds itself back at war once again, this time in a hot war, the Korean War. And that's going to go on for 4 long years, requires remobilization, requires a new draft, and is both a shock and disappointment to many people who had hoped that the post-war order would lead to something else. There is also a set of domestic and ideological anxieties that are underway. So the reading for this week is Friedrich Hayek's famous book, The Road to Serfdom. And Hayek, like many of the people that we've looked at and talked about over the course of this semester, is sitting in his office in 1944, looking out at what's happening in the world, trying to make sense of it, to think ahead about where it all might be going. He is an Austrian economist. He has moved to London, but he's really looking out over the Anglo-American world and over what's happened over the course of the New Deal and then the war, and saying, this looks actually quite terrible, and I have a warning about the future. It's not so much a geopolitical warning. It's a warning about this whole vision of government planning, of social welfare, of military coordination, of this enormous growth of the state that has happened in the United States and other places as a result of the politics of the 1930s and 1940s. We saw lots of championing of that in our New Deal lecture. But Hayek stands in for a whole generation of people who are actually quite skeptical and think that things have really gone wrong. To reduce his argument down to its essence, I have cartoon number 1 of a cartoon version of The Road to Serfdom that came out to try to popularize some of these ideas. And as you can see, he starts out with a critique that all of this planning, all of this government power, all of these visions of a better order are in fact violating not only good economics, but violating individual liberty, and in fact are leading us down what he describes as the road to serfdom, though he could have described it as the road to servitude, which was actually Alexis de Tocqueville's phrase. And Hayek took that phrase from de Tocqueville and thought the road to serfdom was a little catchier. The Road to Serfdom becomes one of the most popular texts in the United States in 1945. It's distributed very widely, and in particular, it's taken up by a kind of business lobby that ultimately becomes really central to the politics of anti-communism. That business lobby taking this up as a critique of these concentrations of government power, and ultimately, this really becomes one of the canonical texts of a conservative movement, a self-conscious one that we're going to talk about next week. For now, I want to stick with what happens here in the United States in domestic politics in this period from 1946 up to 1954, which is a period known as the Second Red Scare, or just the Red Scare. So the 1946 election becomes incredibly important in this story because after these years, more than a decade of Democratic Party dominance, the Republican Party finally wins the 1946 House election and runs on the platform of republicanism versus communism. And what that means is, in fact, that the Republican Party is trying to take up this anti-communist banner not only as an attack on the Communist Party, though we will see that that happens as well, but as a broader critique of the New Deal. The New Deal as having adopted socialistic ideas, these concentrations of power in independent agencies, but also the New Deal as having been, quote unquote, infiltrated by communists, going after this vision of this big left liberal spectrum and saying that it is corrupt, it is disloyal, and it is un-American. That begins to play out in various ways in American policy. 1947 becomes the year that the Taft-Hartley bill is passed, which constrains some of the labor power that we had seen emerging in the 1930s. It's also an era when national health insurance is being proposed by the Truman administration, but that too is defeated largely on the logic that it is a socialistic policy. It is too much like what you might see under a socialist regime, and it is defeated for many generations in that moment. These are also the years when the domestic Red Scare really begins to get going. I wrote about that a lot in my biography of J. Edgar Hoover, and in some ways I think that he is the more important and interesting figure for thinking about how the Red Scare actually played out at home, because he's there long before Joseph McCarthy comes into office, and he lasts long after Joseph McCarthy is gone. Hoover, I think, is also a good representative of the central fact of the Red Scare, which is that, like the Cold War, it was not only one thing. It was a set of cultural initiatives, right? Attempts to control what's being produced out of Hollywood, grassroots movements that are attempting to push back against quote-unquote communism and define Americanism. J. Edgar Hoover's book, Masters of Deceit, becomes sort of the textbook for the grassroots anti-communist logic. It comes out in the late 50s, and he says it's not just this geopolitical struggle, it is something that gets at all of these fundamental questions about what the United States is and how we ought to live, and that it is the obligation of every citizen in the country to carry that on. But Hoover, as the head of the FBI, is also responsible for and linked to a whole set of other institutional initiatives that are happening on lots of different levels. Some of them are happening through congressional committees, the House Un-American Activities Committee, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee begins calling up people who are accused of either being members of the Communist Party or parroting the quote-unquote Soviet line, being too close to far-left politics, being too close to the Soviet Union. They are brought up, they are interrogated in front of congressional committees. One of the great spectacles of this era, those congressional hearings, and the fact that they are being televised. There's also the FBI itself, which goes through an enormous expansion in its surveillance capacities during these years, begins using methods like informants and wiretapping to investigate not only the Communist Party, but many other organizations on the left. A lot of that is driven by a set of accusations about Soviet espionage, and one of the dramatic set of spectacles that emerge in the late 40s are a series of trials and hearings around espionage accusations. Accusations against State Department official Alger Hiss that he had passed information along to the Soviets. Accusations that the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, had been passing along atomic information from Los Alamos and elsewhere during the war. So these espionage trials are in many ways the things that polarize the country around this question. Which side were you on in the Hiss case or the Rosenberg case tells you a lot about where your political loyalties are in this moment. But there are many other mechanisms at work. In 1947, Harry Truman passes the Federal Employment Loyalty Act. It's an executive, I guess it's not an act, it's an executive order in which he requires loyalty investigations of all government employees. There are investigations of Hollywood screenwriters. The Hollywood blacklist begins to emerge, and a lot of this is carried out through private employment as well. One of the most dramatic trials of that moment comes in 1948, 49, and 1950, when the entire leadership of the American Communist Party is put on trial in federal court under a law called the Smith Act. And the Smith Act was a law that had been passed in 1940 to attempt to contain domestic dissent. But what's interesting about the Smith Act is that it's a law about speech and loyalty. It says if you belong to or believe in an organization that advocates revolution in the United States, the overthrow of the government, then that set of ideas in itself is enough to subject you to criminal prosecution. And in fact, they are convicted, and many members of the Communist Party go to jail. I'm going to save that for a moment. So all of this is happening before Joseph McCarthy ever comes on the scene in a significant way. He had been elected to Congress in 1946 to the Senate, but he's pretty obscure until 1950, the moment that he makes this famous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, when he says, you know what? There are a bunch of communists still in the State Department, despite all of this surveillance, despite all of the congressional hearings that have been happening, despite everything that's been going on in the 1940s. The problem is more urgent than ever, and I am here to fight it. Now, it's interesting that that speech in 1950 becomes quite as famous as it does because he's saying pretty ordinary things. By 1950, there is no one in the US government who is expressing much sympathy for the Communist Party or for the Soviet Union. And so in that sense, McCarthy is very mainstream. These ideas are in some ways not controversial at all. And so the interesting thing about Joseph McCarthy in particular is what makes him so controversial as a figure. And it has less, I would argue, to do with his ideas than it has to do with his political style. Right? McCarthy comes in as a populist and says, look, what's happened over the last generation of American politics is not only that these left-wing ideas have infiltrated the government, but that we ought to blame it on American elites, as he says here, on the traitorous actions of those who have been treated so well by this nation. And so he engages in a kind of populist politics, an anti-elite politics that proves to have enormous power in this moment to bring a grassroots enthusiasm into the anti-communist cause. McCarthy is also important for his political style. And when people at the time talked about having an opinion pro-McCarthy, anti-McCarthy, pro-McCarthyism, anti-McCarthyism, that's really what they're talking about. Not so much anti-communism, which is extremely ordinary, but a political style in which accusations are being made against people who have very little ability to defend themselves. And McCarthy really becomes a master of the media. He is able to generate headline after headline after headline, and the fact checkers are kind of chasing him through this whole period. He comes out and says, there are 205 communists in the State Department, and by the time ordinary newspaper reporters have gone and said, who are they? Do we really have the reports about all of this? McCarthy has moved on to the next thing, onto the next accusation, and is really dominating the news cycle. So that is a lot of what McCarthyism stood for in its moment, what people described as a kind of punch you in the face, big lie, populist politics. And that's why he was controversial in his moment. When people talked about McCarthy, they were talking often less about his ideas than about his methods. But those methods turn out to be quite popular in much of the country as well. 1952 turns out to be a watershed election for the Republican Party. After being really out of power for a generation, they come in and retake the Congress as well as the White House, with Dwight Eisenhower at the top of the ticket. And one of the interesting pieces about McCarthyism is the way in which these battles over McCarthy as a figure, over his brand of populist politics, over his political style, really both unite and divide the Republican Party during this period. Eisenhower himself is not a fan of McCarthy. He doesn't like him much, but he does not move away from him or denounce him in 1952 because he thinks that McCarthy's brand of anti-communist politics is really going to be what puts the Republicans over the top. And that is really the dominant narrative into the late years of the McCarthy era. The Republican Party by 1953 has some uneasy elements, some concerns about him, but they nonetheless give him a Senate committee that he then begins to use to carry out his campaign on a much grander level. It's worth noting that television is coming into being during these years, and McCarthy, like many successful politicians in American history, knows how to use the new communications medium that is coming out. Other congressional committees are beginning to televise some of their work as well. McCarthy uses this committee to have a series of dramatic hearings and show trials that are these cycles of accusation and defense. But as he goes along, there is also a growing critique that says, wait a minute, in this debate about what is American versus un-American, maybe it's actually Joe McCarthy who is the un-American. And that comes to a peak in 1954 with the broadcast of a man named Edward R. Murrow, famous early journalist in television, radio first, then television. And I'm going to show you a brief clip of Edward R. Murrow denouncing McCarthyism, a moment that's often identified as the beginning of the end of the Red Scare and of McCarthy's own career.
No one familiar with the history of his country can deny that congressional committees are useful. It is necessary to investigate before legislating. But the line between investigating and persecuting is a very fine one, and the junior senator from Wisconsin has stepped over it repeatedly. His primary achievement has been in confusing the public mind as between the internal and the external threats of communism. We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. We must remember always that accusation is not proof, and that conviction depends upon evidence and due process of law. We will not walk in fear one of another. We will not be driven by fear into an age of unreason if we dig deep in our history and our doctrine, and remember that we are not descended from fearful men, not from men who feared to write, to speak, to associate, and to defend causes that were for the moment unpopular. This is no time for men who oppose Senator McCarthy's methods to keep silent, or for those who approve. We can deny our heritage and our history, but we cannot escape responsibility for the result. There is no way for a citizen of a republic to abdicate his responsibilities. As a nation, we have come into our full inheritance at a tender age. We proclaim ourselves, as indeed we are, the defenders of freedom wherever it continues to exist in the world. But we cannot defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home. The actions of the junior senator from Wisconsin have caused alarm and dismay amongst our allies abroad and given considerable comfort to our enemies. And whose fault is that? Not really his. He didn't create this situation of fear. He merely exploited it, and rather successfully. Cassius was right. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Good night, and good luck.
So that speech is so famous, that broadcast, because first, it is a call to conscience and a call to action in this moment of 1954. Second, it's a pushback against the idea that what is American is the suppression of dissent, the suppression of certain ideas, the suppression of political loyalties that aren't very popular, and instead, an attempt to say actually what's un-American is what someone like Joseph McCarthy was up to. And it's powerful partly because it goes on to be quite effective. By the middle of 1954, McCarthy is under a lot of political pressure. There are a series of hearings investigating him called the Army McCarthy hearings. And by the end of 1954, the Senate has censured Joe McCarthy and largely driven him out of political life. He dies of complications from alcoholism just a few years later and disappears off the American political scene. But I want to finish up by saying what I suggested earlier, which is that the rise and fall of Joe McCarthy doesn't really capture why this moment is significant or why it matters for the long term. The changes that happened during this period of the early Cold War and the Red Scare go on to have lasting institutional, political, and cultural significance in lots of other ways. That military-industrial complex that began to be built in the late 40s and 50s to fight the Cold War. That is Dwight Eisenhower's term when he leaves office in 1961. He says, look, there's something new in the American land, this military-industrial complex that is playing a new role in American politics. There is a new and lasting language about Americanism and un-Americanism, and particularly a deepening of suspicion toward a set of political strategies and ideas that become labeled as socialistic or communistic. And in fact, every movement, every political figure that emerges after this moment has to contend in one way or another, both with the pressures of the Cold War and with this set of debates at home about communism, anti-communism, Americanism, and un-Americanism. And I'll just finish off by saying that, of course, for the people who were targeted, who were under surveillance, who suffered during the Red Scare, there wasn't a lot of going back. A lot of people's lives were ruined. A lot of people lost their jobs and their careers. And Paul Robeson was one of them, ultimately. Robeson, in the 1950s, not only loses his passport, but he is blacklisted and really driven out of American cultural life. He doubles down on his loyalty to some degree to the Communist Party, but to Stalin and the Soviet Union, insists on continuing to defend that politics of the 1930s, long after many people say it has passed its due date, and even after many of the crimes of the Stalinist regime have been revealed. Ultimately, Robeson tries to revive his international career once he gets his passport back in the late 1950s, but it doesn't work very well. And in the early 60s, he goes to the Soviet Union for a few years, in part because he's a celebrated figure there, and in part because he needs health care that he can't get in the United States. And I just want to finish with this document that I came across when I was writing the biography of J. Edgar Hoover that I published a few years ago. This is a document from a couple of FBI spies who had infiltrated the Communist Party and then been sent over to the Soviet Union to confer as international representatives of the communists and then secretly report back to the FBI. But in that moment, they go and they sit down with Paul Robeson and try to find out what's going on in his life. And as you can see, he has really a very sad end. He has a lot of health difficulties. He attempts suicide in the Soviet Union and never really has the comeback that he sought. He eventually came back to the United States and died here in Philadelphia in 1976 in the bicentennial year. But his moment of being the voice of America by that point had, of course, been radically curtailed. We will leave it here. For those of you who were not here 10 minutes before class started, I'm going to replay Ballad for Americans if you want to hear the whole thing. And it's worth thinking about, for those of you who were here, whether it sounds the same after hearing that story or whether it sounds a little different.